The fog was thick that night. It rolled across the French countryside in waves, clinging to the ground like a living thing. The fields were silent except for the rustle of canvas and the hiss of air pumps. Soldiers moved in the darkness, their breath visible in the cold, their hands working quickly, methodically. They were setting up tanks. But something was wrong. The tanks were too light. The soldiers lifted them with ease, carrying them across the field like stage props. The cannons sagged. The treads didn't bite into the mud. The metal wasn't metal at all, it was rubber, canvas, inflated with air. In the tree-line, a German scout lay motionless, watching through binoculars. He counted the tanks. 12, 15, 20. An entire armored division. He could see the shapes clearly, even in the fog. Sherman tanks. American. Heavy armor. A serious threat. He pulled out his radio and whispered into it, his voice urgent. Enemy armor division spotted. Grid reference 479er. At least 20 vehicles. Repeat, 20 vehicles. On the other end, a German officer marked the location on his map. He ordered artillery to prepare. He redirected troops. He sent word up the chain of command. The Americans were massing for an attack. But they weren't. The tanks were fake. The division was fake. The entire operation was a lie. And the lie was about to save thousands of lives. What if the greatest deception of World War II wasn't a lie, but a performance? The impossible mission by the spring of 1944, the war had reached a tipping point. The Allies were preparing for the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day, the assault on Nazi-occupied France. The stakes could not have been higher. If the invasion failed, the war could drag on for years. If it succeeded, the Allies would have a foothold in Europe, a path to Berlin, a chance to end the nightmare. But there was a problem. The Germans knew the invasion was coming. They had fortified the coast of France with bunkers, mines, artillery, and thousands of troops. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had turned the Atlantic Wall into a fortress. The Allies would be landing on beaches swept by machine gun fire, under the shadow of concrete pillboxes, into a killing zone designed to stop them cold. The Allies needed an advantage. They needed the Germans to make a mistake, to divide their forces, to look the wrong way at the wrong time. They needed deception. But this wasn't about hiding troops or disguising movements. This was about creating an entire phantom army, a force that didn't exist, but looked so real, so convincing, that the enemy would have no choice but to respond. And so, in the greatest secrecy, the U.S. Army created the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. They called them the Ghost Army, but these weren't ordinary soldiers. They were artists, set designers, sound engineers, radio operators, actors, men who had spent their lives creating illusions on canvas, on stage, in studios. Now they would create illusions on the battlefield. Their mission was simple and impossible: make the enemy see what isn't there. The artists who became soldiers, the men of the Ghost Army, came from all over America. Some were painters and illustrators, recruited from art schools in New York and Philadelphia. Among them was Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. Ellsworth Kelly, who would become a renowned abstract painter. Art Kane, who would revolutionize fashion photography. Others were engineers and technicians, experts in sound and radio. A few were actors, men who knew how to play a role, how to sell a lie with confidence and charm. They were not the soldiers you'd expect to find on the front lines. Many had never fired a rifle. Some had never even been camping. But they had skills. The Army needed skills that couldn't be taught in boot camp. They arrived at Camp Forest in Tennessee in early 1944, confused and curious. Their training was unlike anything in the military. They learned how to inflate a tank in 15 minutes. The tanks were made of rubberized canvas stretched over a metal frame, inflated with air pumps. When fully inflated, they looked exactly like real Sherman tanks from a distance. Up close, you could see the seams, the sag of the rubber, the way they bounced slightly in the wind. But from a few hundred yards, or through binoculars, or from a German reconnaissance plane, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. They learned how to operate sound trucks, specially modified vehicles equipped with massive speakers and playback equipment. The trucks carried recordings of engine noises, the clank of tank treads, the shouts of soldiers, the rumble of heavy artillery being moved. When played at high volume, the sounds could be heard for miles, creating the illusion of a massive military buildup. They learned how to mimic radio traffic. Radio operators were trained to send fake messages, to create the chatter of an entire division's supply requests, movement orders, casualty reports. The Germans were listening, and the volume of traffic alone would tell them that a large force was operating in the area. They learned how to dress the part. They wore the insignias of different divisions' units that were actually fighting elsewhere. They drove jeeps into nearby towns, flashing their patches, letting locals see them, knowing that word would spread, that German spies would report back. They learned how to act. One soldier, a former theater student from Boston named Harold Dahl, later recalled his first training exercise. He was told to walk into a French cafe, order a drink, and casually mention that his division was moving up to the front. He was terrified, not of combat, but of forgetting his lines, of breaking character, of giving away the deception. He walked in, ordered wine, and struck up a conversation with the bartender. He complained about the long march. He mentioned his unit by name, a fake unit. He talked about how tired the men were. He left a generous tip and walked out. Later, intelligence confirmed that German agents had been in the cafe. The information had been passed along. The deception had worked. He had never fired a shot, but he had just fought his first battle, Operation Brittany. The first test, their first real mission, came in the summer of 1944, shortly after D-Day. Operation Brittany. The Allies had successfully landed in Normandy on June 6th, but the fighting was brutal. The Germans were dug in, fighting for every hedgerow, every village, every inch of ground. The Allies needed to break out, to push south and east, to liberate France. But the Germans still had significant forces in Brittany, the peninsula jutting out into the Atlantic. If those forces moved north and east, they could threaten the Allied advance. The Allies needed to keep them pinned down. That's where the Ghost Army came in. They set up near the coast, south of Brest. It was their first time in enemy territory, their first time under the threat of German artillery and air raids. The fear was real. The danger was real. They worked at dusk, when the light was low and the shadows were long. Soldiers unrolled the inflatable tanks, attached the air pumps, and watched as the rubber shapes swelled and took form. Within minutes, an entire armored division appeared in the field. They positioned the tanks carefully, mimicking the deployment patterns of real armored units. They created tank tracks in the mud using special rollers. They scattered empty fuel cans and supply crates. They even hung laundry between the fake tanks, a detail that made the scene look lived in, authentic. Sound trucks moved into position. At nightfall, they began playing their recordings. The rumble of engines, the clank of treads, the shouts of officers. The sounds echoed across the countryside, reaching German listening posts miles away. Radio operators began transmitting fake orders, fake supply requests, fake casualty reports, the chatter of an entire division preparing for battle. And then the final touch. Soldiers put on the insignias of the 2nd Armored Division, a real unit fighting far to the east. They drove into nearby towns, visited cafes and shops, let themselves be seen. The Germans took the bait. Reconnaissance planes photographed the tanks. Intelligence reports confirmed a major buildup. German commanders redirected troops to defend against the expected attack. But the attack never came. The real Allied advance happened elsewhere, meeting lighter resistance because the Germans had moved their forces to counter a threat that didn't exist. The Ghost Army had done its job. Lives had been saved, and no one outside the unit would know for 50 years. Living the lie, the Ghost Army moved from operation to operation, setting up fake divisions, playing their recordings, transmitting their false radio chatter. They spent weeks at a time in enemy territory, often within range of German artillery, always at risk of being discovered. The fear was constant. If the Germans realized the deception, if they sent scouts to investigate, if they captured even one member of the Ghost Army, the entire operation would be exposed. Deception was a legitimate tactic of war, but the Ghost Army operated in a gray area. They weren't combat troops. They weren't spies. They were something in between. The psychological toll was immense. Combat soldiers face fear, but they also have the clarity of action. They know what they're supposed to do: fight, shoot, take cover, advance. The Ghost Army had no such clarity. Their job was to pretend, to deceive, to maintain an illusion. They had to act confident when they were terrified. They had to seem casual when they were in mortal danger. One soldier later described the experience as living in a constant state of performance anxiety. He said, "In theater, if you forget your lines, the show goes on. In war, if you break character, people die." The isolation was crushing. They couldn't talk about their work with anyone outside the unit. They couldn't write home about what they were doing. They couldn't even talk to other American soldiers. Harold Dahl later wrote in his journal, "We are ghosts. We exist, but we don't. We matter, but no one knows. We fight, but we never fire a shot. I don't know if what we're doing is brave or absurd. Maybe it's both." In October 1944, during one operation, a German patrol came within 100 yards of a Ghost Army position. The soldiers froze, lying flat in the grass, watching as German scouts moved through the area. The inflatable tanks were visible in the field behind them. If the Germans got any closer, the deception would be over. The patrol moved on. The Germans never realized what they had almost discovered. But the Ghost Army soldiers lay in the grass for hours afterward, hearts pounding, replaying the moment over and over in their minds. One soldier later said, "That was the closest I came to combat, and I never fired a shot." Operation Viersen. The final performance, their greatest mission, came in March 1945. Operation Viersen. The war in Europe was nearing its end. The Allies had pushed the Germans back to the Rhine River, the last natural barrier before Germany itself. Crossing the Rhine would be the final decisive blow, but it would also be one of the most dangerous operations of the war. The Germans had fortified the eastern bank with artillery, machine gun nests, and minefields. Any crossing would be costly. The Allies planned to cross at Wesel, a strategic location in the north. But they needed the Germans to think the crossing was happening somewhere else. The Ghost Army was ordered to set up a fake crossing operation at Viersen, several miles to the south. The deception had to be perfect. The Germans had to believe that an entire corps, tens of thousands of soldiers, was preparing to cross the Rhine at Viersen. They set up in the forests along the river. They inflated tanks and artillery. They positioned sound trucks and played recordings of engineers building pontoon bridges, of trucks moving supplies, of soldiers massing for the assault. Radio operators transmitted a constant stream of fake messages. Engineers reported progress on the fake bridges. Supply officers requested ammunition and fuel. Medical units prepared for casualties. And then, to sell the illusion completely, the Allies brought in real artillery and fired a few rounds across the river at Viersen. The Germans fired back. The artillery duel continued for hours. Shells screamed overhead and exploded in the forests. The Ghost Army soldiers dove for cover, their inflatable tanks shredded by shrapnel, their sound trucks damaged, their equipment destroyed. But they held the line. They kept transmitting, kept playing the recordings, kept maintaining the illusion, even as shells fell around them. One soldier later described the experience. "We were being shelled because we were doing our job too well. The Germans believed we were real, and they were trying to kill us." The fear was unlike anything they had experienced before. This was combat, real artillery, real explosions, real danger of death, and they couldn't fight back. They had no weapons, no armor, no way to defend themselves except to maintain the deception. They stayed for 2 days under constant artillery fire, keeping up the illusion. And at Wesel, the real crossing began. The Germans, focused on the fake operation at Viersen, were caught off guard. The Allies crossed the Rhine with lighter resistance than expected. Thousands of soldiers made it across. The bridgehead was established. The war in Europe would be over in 2 months. The Ghost Army had played their final, greatest performance. And it had worked. But it had cost them. Several soldiers were wounded by shrapnel. Equipment was destroyed. And the psychological toll was immense. One soldier later said, "That's when I understood what we were. We weren't soldiers. We weren't actors. We were sacrifices. We were bait. And we did our job." 50 years of silence when the war ended. The Ghost Army was quietly disbanded. The men packed up their equipment, said goodbye to each other, and went home. But they couldn't talk about what they had done. The entire operation was classified, top secret. The government didn't want potential enemies to know that such deception was possible, that entire armies could be faked, that sound and radio and rubber could fool trained military intelligence. So the men went home and said nothing. They became artists again, teachers, engineers, fathers. They lived ordinary lives. They went to work, paid their bills, raised their families. And they carried a secret that no one would believe even if they told it. Some tried to talk about it, carefully, vaguely. But without proof, without documentation, their stories sounded like fantasies. Inflatable tanks? Sound effects? A phantom army? It sounded like something from a comic book, not from real history. So they stopped trying. One veteran later said, "I fought in World War II. I was in France, in Belgium, in Germany. I helped win the war, but I couldn't tell anyone how." For 50 years, the Ghost Army remained classified. Their names didn't appear in history books. Their operations weren't taught at military academies. Their contributions weren't recognized at reunions or memorials. They were heroes no one had heard of. The psychological cost of secrecy took a profound psychological toll. Many veterans struggled with feelings of invisibility, of being erased from history. They had done something extraordinary, but they had no way to prove it, no way to share it, no way to be recognized for it. Some developed anxiety and depression. Some withdrew from social situations, unable to connect with other veterans who could talk freely about their service. Family relationships suffered. Wives and children knew that something was being kept from them, but they didn't know what. Some families grew distant, the secret creating an invisible wall between the veteran and his loved ones. One veteran's daughter later said, "My father was there, but he wasn't. He was always somewhere else in his mind. I didn't understand until after he died, when the story was declassified. Then I understood. He had been carrying this secret his entire life, and it had weighed on him every day. One veteran wrote in a letter, "My son asked me what I did in the war. I told him I was in a special unit. He asked what kind. I couldn't tell him. He thinks I did nothing. He thinks I was a clerk or a cook. He doesn't know that I helped save lives, and I can't tell him." The secrecy also created a strange sense of unreality. Without external validation, without recognition, some veterans began to question their own memories. Did it really happen? Were the inflatable tanks real? Did we really fool the Germans? The truth revealed in 1996, the story was finally declassified. Documents were released. Veterans were allowed to speak. Historians began researching the Ghost Army, interviewing the surviving members, piecing together the full scope of their operations. The world finally learned what they had done. Between June 1944 and March 1945, the Ghost Army conducted more than 20 deception operations across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. They simulated entire divisions, fooling German intelligence again and again. They drew enemy fire away from real units. They created diversions that allowed real operations to succeed with fewer casualties. Military historians estimate that the Ghost Army's deceptions saved tens of thousands of Allied lives. They were credited with contributing to the success of D-Day, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine, and the final push into Germany. And they did it all without firing a shot. The veterans, now elderly, finally received recognition. They were invited to speak at military events, at museums, at schools. Their story was featured in documentaries and books. In 2024, they were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. But for many of them, the recognition came too late. Most of the Ghost Army veterans had already passed away, taking their stories with them. The few who remained were in their 90s, their memories fading, their voices weak. One veteran, asked how it felt to finally be recognized, said simply, "I'm glad people know, but I wish my wife could have known. I wish I could have told her." Another veteran said, "For 50 years, I thought what we did didn't matter. Now I know it did. I just wish I had known sooner." Legacy, the Ghost Army, represents something profound about courage. We think of courage as charging into battle, as facing the enemy with a rifle in hand, as standing firm under fire. And that is courage. That is heroism. But the Ghost Army showed a different kind of courage. They faced the enemy without weapons. They fought with creativity, with intelligence, with deception. They put themselves in danger not to kill, but to deceive. They saved lives not by taking them, but by creating illusions so convincing that the enemy had no choice but to believe. They were soldiers who never fired a shot, artists who became warriors, performers who played the most important role of their lives and couldn't tell anyone about it for 50 years. Bill Blass later said, "Everything I learned about illusion, about creating something that looks real but isn't, I learned in the war. Fashion is deception. You create an image, a persona, something that makes people believe. The Ghost Army taught me that." Ellsworth Kelly said, "In the war, I learned that what you see depends on where you stand, on the light, on the context. I learned that reality is not fixed. That became the foundation of my art. These men were artists who became soldiers, then soldiers who became artists again. The war didn't interrupt their creative lives, it deepened them, gave them new tools, new perspectives, new understanding of how perception shapes reality." Remembering the ghosts, there's a memorial now in Washington, D.C., honoring the Ghost Army. It shows a soldier standing next to an inflatable tank, one hand on the rubber, looking out toward the horizon. The inscription reads, "The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, 1944 to 1945. They fought without firing a shot. They saved thousands of lives through deception, creativity, and courage. For 50 years, their story remained classified. Now we remember." Veterans' families visit the memorial. They touch the bronze soldier, read the inscription, learn the story their fathers and grandfathers couldn't tell them. In a museum in New Jersey, an inflatable Sherman tank sits on display. It's old now, the rubber cracked, the paint faded. But it's still there, still holding its shape, still a testament to what was possible. Visitors walk past it, reading the plaque, learning the story. Some are amazed. Some are skeptical. Some don't understand how a rubber tank could have mattered. But it did. It mattered to the soldiers who crossed the Rhine while the Germans were distracted elsewhere. It mattered to the families who got their sons and husbands and fathers back because the Ghost Army's deception worked. It mattered to the course of the war, to the shape of history. The final truth: the Ghost Army conducted 20 major operations. They simulated more than a dozen different divisions. They fooled German intelligence again and again, and they saved an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 lives. 10,000 to 30,000 people who came home from a war because a group of artists inflated rubber tanks and played sound effects and transmitted fake radio messages. 10,000 to 30,000 families who weren't destroyed by loss because the Ghost Army did their job. That's the legacy. Not medals or monuments or recognition, though those came eventually. The legacy is the lives saved, the families kept whole, the futures that were allowed to happen because the Ghost Army stood in a field in France and created an illusion so perfect that the enemy believed it. They were not the soldiers you see in movies. They were not the heroes you read about in textbooks. They were artists and dreamers and performers who found themselves in a war and discovered that the skills that seemed useless, frivolous, unimportant were exactly what was needed. They proved that courage doesn't always look like combat, that heroism doesn't always involve weapons, that sometimes the greatest contribution you can make is to create an illusion so perfect that the enemy believes it, acts on it, and loses because of it. They were the Ghost Army. They fought without firing a shot. They saved thousands of lives. And for 50 years, no one knew. But now we know, and we remember, not as the soldiers who won the war, but as the soldiers who helped win it in the most unexpected way possible, with rubber tanks, sound effects, and the power of imagination. They were ghosts, but they were real, and their story will never be forgotten again.